Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Bill and Mesfin Packwood, founder of Change Consulting. Thank you for joining us today for Change the Story, Black Voices and Black Narratives. This is the first of many events and programs we will do under Change the Story to explore the power of storytelling and narrative in creating real change for our communities. I started Change Consulting, as some of y'all know, about 16 years ago to equip racial justice leaders and organizations to better tell their stories. And I came into this work as a former journalist, a lifelong storyteller. And for many, many years, when we first started, Change primarily focused on earned media services. Today, Change is a multiracial, multicultural team of 14 folks. And yes, we do still do a lot of earned media, but we've also added communication strategy, digital content, and trading services to help changemakers realize their mission and our shared vision of racial justice. We call this event Change the Story because that's what we try to do every day. We try to change the stories, the frames, and the narratives that make bad racist policies possible. And over a decade and a half and hundreds of clients and projects, we've seen how compelling storytelling can really elevate the issues we need to care about, shift public discourse, win real policy reforms, and grow leaders and organizations. Today, in what is probably the most out of control news environment that I've ever seen in my career, if we're keeping all the way real, and ahead of another unprecedented election cycle, we wanted to take a moment and reflect on how the stories we tell shape narratives and how the stories we hear shape our reality. I'm so excited about our panel of talented journalists. Let me tell you, I'm in their inboxes and their texts all the time, asking them to cover stories. And I'm thrilled they agreed to be part of this conversation with me. Because not only are they journalists and storytellers, I also see them as true change makers in their own right. So first up, we have Cheyenne Daniels, who is the race and politics reporter at The Hill and the creator and host of the Switch Up podcast. On her beat and podcast, she gets deep into the intersection of race and politics, and she does a tremendous job of featuring and centering leading voices of color about the most important issues facing our communities. Next up is Justin Phillips, who's a columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle, focusing on race and inequality in the Bay Area. I think he's one of the most important voices in the Bay Area who always offers nuanced takes on the issues impacting Black communities and communities of color in the region. He always has an interesting and really deep take on what is happening that we often don't get anywhere else with any other reporter or outlet. And then last but not least, Jessica Washington is a freelance national political reporter. When we first started working together, she was covering race and gender at the root, but her work has appeared in Mother Jones Magazine, The Guardian, The Washington Post, The City, The Star Tribune, and much more. And like I said, she specializes in race and gender, as well as health coverage. So thank y'all so much for agreeing to be here today. I told them earlier that I was so glad that even after stalking them for many, many years, they still agreed to be here on this call with me. So thank you for your time. We're going to get into the discussion, and I have some questions for them, and then we'll open it up to questions from you all. So please do put any questions you may have in the chat, and we'll get to it as part of the conversation. But first, getting into the panel, I want to start with just your story. I'll start with you, Jessica, and then Justin, and then Cheyenne. Tell me what got you interested in journalism and storytelling. What got you into this field in this sector?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me here. I'm excited to share a little bit more. Yeah, so I got started in journalism when I was about 10 years old, which is kind of an unusual story. I ended up meeting the editor of a really small, like hyper local paper in DC, the Northwest Current. And I ended up just writing kids columns for them. And I think at that time it was just fun. I loved storytelling. I loved narrative. I loved talking to people, kind of all the things that make a journalist a journalist. And then as I got older, I continued to be interested in journalism, but I learned more about the world and about the power of storytelling and journalism and what it could mean for people to share their stories. And as I grew as a journalist, I started to realize how much it meant to my sources to have their stories shared, to in some cases have their lives changed. So yeah, that's my story.
We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit too. Justin, how about you?
Yeah, I like this question. It was something I guess I hadn't thought about, but so I grew up in Louisiana, and I was a teenager when Hurricane Katrina happened. And I remember, so like the city I was in was far enough removed from New Orleans to where like people who evacuated from New Orleans would come to where we were. And we still got hit pretty bad, but it was still safer there. And I remember as a teen, like reading the coverage out of New Orleans, and then kind of like it was a lot of stuff that was like, in the immediate aftermath was, about how it was all anarchy. It was a lot of focus on bureaucracy and failings of local government, national response, those kinds of things. But I would also like compare those stories to people that I knew that were coming from New Orleans or were talking to their family that were there. And I remember, thinking how there were stories that weren't being told immediately. Like there were, you know, stories of like Black pain and suffering and, neighborhoods that seemed to be overlooked. It's just in the immediate coverage. I was talking to folks and it just seemed like there was things that were missing. And so that was the first time I ever thought like, man, I wish I could be a part of something like this. Like in high school, I liked writing. That moment I think was a catalyst for me. And I was like, you know what, I might try to pursue this. And I think that's where it started for me.
Wow. A moment of connection. I'm in Atlanta right now for the launch of Black to the Future Action Fund, Black Economic Agenda. And Dawn Richard from Danity Kane, I don't know if we all remember, she was one of the speakers, and she talked about growing up in Louisiana, going through Katrina, and realizing that yes, it was the hurricane, but really it was the lack of Black political power that really devastated those communities. And I'm also hearing kind of how the coverage added to that lack of powerlessness and that lack of power and just so just making I wanted to take a moment to make that
That's,
connection.
yeah, perfect way to put it. Yeah, I agree.
Cheyenne, how about you?
Yes, so I would also just like to say thank you so much for having me on today. I'm so excited for our conversation. So I always loved writing, but growing up, I never was certain what a career in writing would look like, what that would mean. I didn't want to write novels. I kind of sort of liked poetry, as all angsty teenagers do. And then quite sadly in high school, we lost a beloved teacher. She died from cancer. And, I attended high school in the suburbs of Chicago. And so even though it was very diverse, it was also very segregated. There was a lot of racism in my school. And it took the death of this teacher for the community to really come together. And one of the ways that we did that was by starting a class in which we decided to write oral histories. So we interviewed different members of the communities, from students to parents to teachers to even business owners in the community. And it really shined a light on how similar we all are. Like, there were so many struggles that so many of us were experiencing. I mean, I heard from so many of my peers about the agony that they felt as, being a student of color in a diverse but still predominantly white area, and how that has affected them, what it's meant to be an immigrant coming into this school, all of these different stories that just resonated with me. And it struck me how different things could be if we allowed the space for those who are most impacted and most marginalized the opportunity to speak and to share their story. And I realized that that was something I wanted to continue doing, especially seeing the difference that it could make and how important it was for many of us to feel heard, which was something none of us had felt before. And I was like, that's something I want to keep doing. And in a lot of ways, I feel very blessed that I get to continue to do that and uplift the voices of those in my community today for my job.
And I asked that question because I think for a lot of folks of color or from communities that are not usually represented in media often get into media to be able to tell stories that go overlooked. And so, and also one tech thing is I think we lost Jessica. She's having some connection issues, but she'll get back online. And until then, we'll just keep the show moving. I did want to ask you, Cheyenne, just if you can share experience now that you are in the media, you have a beat where you cover race and inequality in particular. If you can share an experience where your own reporting or storytelling has made a difference and how Black communities or the issues that impact us have been perceived or covered.
So something that I try to cover any chance that I get and has been a very informative conversation for myself as a Black woman is the maternal mortality crisis and how it disproportionately affects Black women and Indigenous women as well. And it's been a real eye-opener, not just for me, but I know as well for my editors. I work in a predominantly white newsroom and having that conversation and saying, hey, if I as a Black woman wasn't aware of all of these statistics, then I know that that means that there are other young Black women just like myself who are unaware of it. And, so I've gotten to do written reports on it. I've gotten to do podcast episodes on it. I held an event in which we spoke with somebody who, while not the maternal mortality crisis, almost sadly became a statistic of that maternal mortality crisis because of the mental health crisis that is plaguing Black birthing people as well. And so she shared her story about how she didn't even know that she was feeling depressed. And she almost became one of those many women who died from postpartum depression. It's another element to the maternal mortality crisis that we don't think of. And it has been so important to me to be able to shine a light on that, to be able to shine a light on the legislation that's trying to be passed from all different legislators, and just the advocacy, the women on the ground who are living through this, who have seen loved ones lose their lives or lose their babies for it. It just remains, it's not exactly an easy topic, but it's one that I'm seeing get a little bit more traction. I think part of that has to do with Vice President Kamala Harris, to be frank, because that's a very big topic that she has been heavily invested in even before her time in the White House. So I'm just hoping to continue shining a light on this topic as my career continues, which will hopefully be for quite a long time.
Well, what an important issue, and something that we focus on the advocacy side of change as well. Another leader I want to recognize, in addition to the vice president, is Holly Mitchell here in California, who has done a tremendous job uplifting the issue to make it a statewide focus for California. So totally agree with you on that. And we're going to go through some questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please do put it in the chat, and we will get to you in about 15 minutes or so. I did want to ask Justin that same question, which is, if you can share an experience or a moment where you really felt like your own reporting or storytelling has made a difference in how Black communities or the issues that impact us are covered.
So the columns that I write sometimes are like based in personal experience. Like it might not be taking a political topic that's happening at the moment. It might just be something I'm thinking about. Like a few years ago, I wrote about how me and the Black people that I grew up around celebrate on the 4th of July, but they don't celebrate the 4th of July. Like there is a there's a difference between it when you think about like what the celebrations that some of us were doing and what a lot of like maybe white people who are very pro-America might be doing. And so like there might be personal stories like that, but I think one of the topics that I focused on in my columns has been reparations. And in California and nationally, I've talked about like the movements around it. I do think like in that reporting and also talking about like the history of the Bay Area, I don't think people understood just how just how rampant racism and discrimination has been throughout the history of like where we live. There were reports that came out that talked about like there being KKK chapters in places like Oakland and San Francisco, and this isn't stuff that I think people really understood. And so granted, like there are people who are adamant that they are against reparations, and you're not going to talk them into supporting it. But I do think like a lot of those columns just talking about like, hey, this is why this stuff matters. This is why this conversation is important. Here's why it can help. Like laying out that history consistently in each piece. Um, I do think like, help the cause in the sense that it had more people talking about it. Now, granted, like more of those people might have been pissed off, but it had more people talking about the topic itself, and I think that was pretty important.
Yeah. I want to ask the same question, Jessica, but before I move on, I did want to ask you in particular, Justin, on this one, because you also do a lot of really important coverage on community safety,
Mhm.
which San Francisco and Oakland in particular has gotten contentious
Yeah, yeah.
in recent months and years. And so I'm curious about just your perspective about how you tell that story, because I feel like you're one of the few folks who don't cover community safety in a way that's just episodic, that is really nuanced, that actually focuses on the systems that allows advocates, quite honestly, to have room to push for
Yeah.
change. Just curious how you tend to approach those types of stories too.
Yeah, I mean, I think thanks for asking about that. Like I think what I'm trying to do is not feed into the problem of this coverage, which is, like we villainize black folks in crime coverage, no matter what. Like we make black people in the Bay Area the boogeyman for everything. Like you wouldn't, and this is just like a small detail, but like we're always portrayed as the perpetrators. We're never covered as the victims in crime, right? So like I wrote a piece a while ago talking about how, like, hate crime data going back decades, the most common victim of hate crime in California throughout the country is a black person. But you wouldn't know that in California. Like it feels like, and the headline was like, why does this feel like a secret? Well, it feels like a secret because of how we cover crime. So what I try to do in my like public safety, community safety coverage is talk about, like the tough stuff, like the root causes of, you know, where crime might be coming from, like lack of investment in those things. Like the stuff that's easy to ignore when you just want to put out a headline about a crime story are the things that I try to focus on. And if you can, and basically the argument is always, if you can address this stuff, rising tide lifts all boats. If you can address this stuff, then everything will improve. But we can't ignore and act like, these areas have lacked investment. These communities have been marginalized, that, they don't have access to X, Y, and Z. Like you have to talk about that stuff, in my opinion, when you talk about public safety. And it's, eh, it hasn't been easy out here. And, what I also realize is that for a lot of our San Francisco Chronicle readers, especially white ones, I might be the only black person they interact with on a regular basis. Like they might get their black information from me. So I feel like there's a responsibility that I have for those people whose social circles might be much smaller than they should be to tell them, deeper stories about what they're seeing in the news.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's super, super thoughtful. I'm going to move us just back ending a little bit off that answer. When I was a journalist in my 20s, a few decades ago, I was the only Black person at the AP bureaus in California, and so I hear you when you say that sometimes we're the only folks in there, and after 2020, after George Floyd, I did see kind of a push in the media towards more commitment toward racial justice and more commitment towards diversifying newsrooms, which folks don't really get how non-diverse newsrooms can really be. And so I was very hopeful about that. And then we are in an era that I think we're seeing kind of a retrenchment in the media from those commitments. CNN, for example, just quietly dissolved its race and equality team. And so I'm curious about how you all are experiencing it, and I'll go to you, Jessica. What have you seen shift in the media, and then what are you seeing now as well in terms of authentic representation and a push towards more diversity?
That's a great question. And I mean, I probably ask the folks in newsrooms this question because I think they're the ones seeing it kind of really directly. Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly difficult media landscape for Black journalists. I mean, I do think there are Black outlets that are doing a really good job of leading coverage. I would say Capital B is, to me, the best example of that. Somewhere that's really still investing in journalism, but from a Black perspective. I think that's difficult to do in terms of just how things are funded in this industry. But yeah, I think there's definitely a bunch of industry shifts. I mean, we've seen layoffs, particularly in race and equity positions all across the country, and yeah, I think definitely in newsrooms there are definitely some Black outlets that are doing really incredible work that should be lifted up and invested in, and I would hope to see more of that. And yeah, specifically talking about places like Capital B, I think it's been really great to see what they're doing.
And what about you, Cheyenne? What are you seeing, and what would you like to see more of?
So this is something that is very important to me. So I am the Hill's only race and politics reporter. They do not have somebody else on this beat with me. In full transparency, there have been times where I'm like, I can't cover everything. I am one person. And also, I know I'm Black, but I don't know every single Black person in this country. So if there was news that was happening in Black America that I missed, perhaps the bigger issue here is this very teeny tiny one-person team, not me. And so this is something I'm actually very outspoken about in my newsroom. Every time we have a meeting with our entire newsroom, I bring it up and I ask flat out, what exactly are you doing to be bringing in candidates of color, specifically Black women, Black men, and brown reporters as well. But I think the missing component oftentimes, especially as we're watching layoffs impacting so many who were brought on, as you said, following the racial reckoning of 2020, is there wasn't an investment into leadership positions for people of color, right? So it was like, great, we'll create this beat. Great, we'll bring in one or two extra reporters. But then if the issue becomes that we don't have an editor or somebody on that leadership team who can take a look at our stories or our pitches and understand the perspective or who we're interviewing, why we're interviewing them, I think that leads to bigger problems, and it shows that it wasn't really a commitment. And I think this is why we're starting to see some of these newsrooms sadly appearing to renege a little bit on their promises, is because they didn't put it in a sustainable way. And I think that then it impacts those reporters too, who came in wanting to make a difference, wanting to report on their communities, wanting to shine a light on this. And then it becomes, well, you have to be the expert on everything Black America, from police violence and the killing of unarmed Black men, and watching these videos incessantly, no matter the toll that it takes on your mental health, to talking about Black voters, but only in the way that we want you to talk about Black voters. And so I think that there deserves to be a little bit of acknowledgement following 2020, but I think that we still have to continue to hold these newsrooms accountable for not really holding up their end of the bargain. Like, they could have done more. And now that, it seems like 2020 is kind of gone, it's not really, they don't have to hold it up anymore. But I think as Black reporters and Black people in the media, it sadly has now fallen onto us to continue to press, which, I'm a very firm believer that those who are oppressed or marginalized should not be the ones to have to solve the problem or end the oppression. But unfortunately, that is where we are in the news industry right now, is being those ones to call out those who are holding the power right now.
I hear that. Thank you. And Justin, I see you just nodding your head. And so I just want to see if you have anything else to add to that as well.
No, those were great points. And I agree with Cheyenne. Like, I think a lot of these newsrooms that realized they hadn't been doing the legwork when it came to diversity, tried to quickly put stuff together and didn't give those teams, like a lot of the teams that we saw popping up, like a good game plan for success. Like, what would the benchmarks be? What do they need to hit? And I think a lot of these newsrooms nationally were waiting for the first place to start cutting this kind of coverage, and they're like, oh, okay, now it's okay for us to do it. Like, and I felt like it was a domino that fell. The thing that I worry about from here is that we're in an election cycle. And the interesting thing about newsrooms is that clicks go up during an election cycle. Like people just read political coverage from wherever they can get it. So there is going to be like, there may not be huge bumps, but there will be bumps in revenue. And I'm curious, after all, after the election, as people are still reading in the follow-up coverage, when newsrooms probably have a little bit more income, are they going to invest in these areas again? But are they gonna say, or instead are they gonna say, like, we tried it, it didn't work, we're gonna put the money elsewhere? And so, it's interesting that they're making these cuts at a time like when people are really reading this stuff. And I'd be curious. I'm worried about where the investments will be. Like it won't come back around. That's the thing that I'm worried about.
And I'm also curious in this moment too, because this is an election where race is like front and center in a way that it's probably not been before. We have the first Black woman candidate of a major presidential party. And so, there was a moment, I think most recently, that I was like, I have to ask about this because former President Trump went to the National Black Journalists Association and had an interview there and had some things to say that really did put race again front and center. And so I just want to ask, what about that moment stands out to you? Do you think it shows why the Black press, not just Black newspapers, but also just Black reporters overall, are so critical? And I'll just open this up. Whoever feels moved to answer can do that.
So I have a problem with my face. I have no poker face. I was once asked by a very sweet child if I would ever be like a press like secretary or comment. And I was like, no, because I can't, like if somebody says something to me, like you will know exactly what I'm thinking. And I felt bad because as you were talking, I know my face was talking, even if my mouth wasn't moving. I think what it really showed, we had consistently been hearing, those of us who paid attention, the way that the esteemed April Ryan was treated in press conferences. We have read her books. We have heard how Abby Phillip was treated, right? We knew this. We were aware. And I think this was the first time really that a lot of editors saw it firsthand when we saw the way that the former president was addressing, particularly Rachel Scott. I think there's a difference between sort of hearing somebody talking about it, sharing it on their show, and watching it unfold in real time. And I'm really sad to say that I don't think it had the impact that I wish it would have, right? The response was all about how the former president spoke to her, but not necessarily about what the implications of that were. And if that's how we're having a conversation around reporters right now, what is going to be the larger conversation around Vice President Kamala Harris, and should she win the election? We saw a little bit of that in 2008 with former President Barack Obama and what he endured. And I think there's just this added layer now because Kamala Harris is a woman. And so you have these double identities, these dual identities, the intersectionality. I was really hopeful that America would kind of see what it means to be a Black reporter in this time when your identity is inherently questioned, right? I mean, me covering race and politics, I consistently get emails from individuals who just dismiss my writing based on the simple fact that I'm Black and so I don't know anything, or I'm somehow biased, or I'm somehow reverse racist toward white folks because I capitalize Black, but we don't capitalize white, or what's wrong with me? Why am I talking about these things? And so I think this is still something that it doesn't matter how in front of our faces, because of how frankly white media power is. It's become something that we've just sort of had to start dealing with on our own. And I think in some ways we protect our editors from the truth. But my hope is that by what we saw Rachel have to endure on that stage in some ways, which was broadcast live, it was on PBS, it was on NABJ, it was on MSN, I mean, it was on all of these places, that hopefully folks will realize like what we're doing, we're not doing it all the time because we have fun. It's because we know that somebody has to, and we don't want to have our community, every person in our community consistently be subjected to that. Not that anybody deserves to have that sort of treatment toward them, but my hope is just like maybe now folks will understand what we're talking about when we say why we're exhausted covering what we cover, even though we love it.
I hear you. And I think you were at NABJ as well and actually witnessed this live, not just on Twitter.
I was there, yes. It was very difficult. There were a lot of conversations. I think some folks could hear there were gasps in the room at certain points. I think regardless of how you feel about the former president, I do know that the reporters, again, particularly Rachel, is a very highly respected reporter amongst NABJ. And there was definitely that moment of, the whole protect our Black women. There was a moment there. There was a moment there where we kind of all had that feeling, that sort of tension of, are we going to have to have some words?
I heard that. And Justin or Jessica, anything else you want to just add and reflect on in terms of that moment and just what this election cycle will be like in terms of coverage?
I mean, reacting to that moment, I think what's unfortunate about what we witnessed is I think there was this hope a little bit that it would be this call out moment of Trump. But what I've witnessed a lot in the aftermath is particularly his comments about Harris not being really Black. Like those comments then got broadcasted out to a bunch of people who then agreed and glommed onto it. So it was this really sad thing where you had this room of Black journalists who so clearly understand who Trump is and, what it means when he says Harris isn't really Black, kind of what he's trying to dismiss the, racial identity of Black Americans all throughout the country who have mixed racial heritage and still claim their Blackness and are still welcomed in our community. I think it's very easy for us to kind of see and call that stuff out. So I think it's important that we're there in these moments to understand the complexity of these issues. But I also think it was a tough moment to watch just because those comments then left the room and they continue to kind of spread out and to spread misinformation. And so I think it's the role then of, unfortunately, of Black journalists, but journalists of color all throughout the United States who now are going to have to kind of re-explain that like racial identity is complex in a way that we automatically understand it.
I agree with both of them. It was it was a wild thing to watch, but I don't have anything to add. I think Jessica and Cheyenne got it all covered.
We have one question, but before we get to that, I did want to ask a question around, how advocacy organizations and organizers in particular can get their stories to break through in the media. I used to be in politics. Media was like our bread and butter. We did a lot of PR work. In advocacy world, I think it's a mixed bag. Some folks focus a lot more on what they call like deeper narrative change work. Some folks really understand the importance of media and PR to drive public discourse and focus on that. But there's I think a lack of knowledge oftentimes around how media actually works and how we can get stories in there and what that takes. And so I would love to have all of y'all just kind of share your advice or best tips in terms of how, either organizing groups or policy advocacy groups can really break through and get their stories covered and get them in the newspaper, on TV, on radio, things like that, especially in this moment where it feels like the news cycle is just absolutely crazy. I'll start with you, Justin, and then would love for all of y'all to weigh on that too.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. One thing that I always encourage groups that I talk to is to be willing to offer your expertise on a variety of topics. Like you don't have to be, you have a wealth of knowledge. You can talk about other things. If an issue pops up that's not really your main focus, but it pops up in the news and you think you can offer something in that, be willing to be quoted about it. Like be an expert on multiple topics, and that's okay because you are that. So I always tell them, like, this might not be up your lane, but I'll hit you up and I would love to put you in this, and people will recognize you as an expert for multiple topics. So I think that's one thing. Also, another thing is just, be proactive. Like I would say, like reach out to journalists, like invite them to events, give them background information. Like it doesn't always have to be a story for your organization, but if you're like, hey, if you need some help on this, I can tell you, some history that might help you or something like that. Like background conversations are always helpful. And I also think, like, using social media to your advantage. Sometimes, like we talk about, like a lot of newsrooms are very white, and an email might not get across the appeal of a story that you're trying to push. But I would say, like, those same newsrooms will chase something that might go viral on social media. So, like, don't be afraid to, if you pitch something, don't hear something back, take content to social media and start a conversation that might get a newsroom's attention. So those are some things I always think about.
It's really great advice around just like even just using your own channels to tell stories to get
Exactly.
it. Love that. Cheyenne, how about you?
I love what Justin said about, be open to, if I can't write a story right now on what you're saying, like, don't be afraid to still give me that background. Don't be afraid to, like, keep reaching out. And if I don't answer, I promise it's not because I don't love you. It's because I can tell you right now, my inbox looks scary. Right. So sometimes we need you to message a couple of times because we get so many pitches, and sometimes it's just like it's just a listserv, and it's not, sorry, my decided he needs to make an appearance. It's not always, we can't always tell, like, is this directed specifically for me, or are you just setting this widespread because you're trying to get your client some sort of FaceTime with the media, which sort of leads me to my second point, which is know who you're pitching, right? Like, I cover race and politics, which is a lot of things. So if you come at me and you want to talk about how John Cena is doing a new movie, I'm not going to respond to you, okay? Right? So you got to know who in the newsroom, who the reporter is that you can make the most headway with, who is most likely to be able to sit there and say, oh, I know what you're getting at here. This is something that I can take the time out of whatever ridiculousness is happening on Capitol Hill or in the Capitol at the state level, whatever it is. Know who it is that you're pitching, and even putting in a little bit of a personalized message, I think sometimes helps us ensure, like, I'm not just on a listserv. This isn't some random message you're sending to 26 million other reporters right now. All of that is super helpful and definitely gives me the willingness, for lack of better word, to do an extra glance over that email or to follow up with you again for that. I can't do this right now, but I want to stay in contact for future stories.
And also, I'm hearing just kind of understanding that media is a long-term game. It's not just about like immediate returns, but you kind of have to stay with it for a while to see kind of the returns, to build relationships, to actually win the trust of reporters too. So I appreciate that. How about you, Jessica? Any additional words of wisdom?
Yeah, for sure. No, I mean, I get pitches like everyone here. I get a lot of pitches. And yeah, cannot get to most of them. I would say the biggest thing is to think through how a story works and then try to actually, I think pitching people with kind of a story in mind is super helpful. And I have some really great sources who do that really well. And so they'll come to me. And obviously, like, I'm not going to just run and take their story completely because it's just not exactly how it works. But it is useful to me when you've thought through what I cover, what I might be interested in. I'm a freelancer, so what outlets I work with, and that kind of stuff, like really coming to me with, hey, we have this new data, or there's this person that I'm pitching who's an advocate who I think would be great. They're talking about this thing, it's in the news. Here's why I think this would be good for this moment. I think when you're pitching, and I get it, there's so many different people that you have to pitch in order to land one story. But instead of say, here's my CEO, do you want to do a profile on them? Which is just something that's unlikely to get greenlit in most newsrooms unless it's like a big person, like a really big deal person, big name already, in which case you're probably not just going to be emailing me that. So if you can think through like, hey, this is something that's happening that I think is really timely, and like, here's a little bit of an angle that I was thinking, but obviously do what you want with this. And we have this data or this expert or this really compelling narrative. And I think it could be really useful to talk about X, Y, and Z. I think it's just all about thinking, looking through our work, if at all possible, to get a sense. And I think Cheyenne touched on that as well, just looking through our work to kind of understand what we do, what we cover, how we cover it. And then if you can come to us with something that's a little bit more concrete, it makes it so much easier for me to then go and pitch my editor something, which again is a ton of work, but I think it saves you work in the long run because you don't have to spam 50 people to get one story. So that's been the sources that I work with who I consistently pick up stories from. Those are the kinds of kind of how they think about it, and it really helps me.
If I could just piggyback super quickly on what Jessica just said, is like, I love profiles. Profiles are so much fun, but for national news organizations, the likelihood that we're going to do a profile isn't very high. Like, you have to, if you want your CEO or your executive director, something like that to be quoted, you have to find a way to make it larger than just, we have a new CEO, or I mean, unless it's the new CEO of SEIU, right? Like some sort of way to show us like, this is how this is going to impact this particular industry, or they're going to be involved with this particular policy making. Because I love profiles, but for a profile, it would be better, I think, for those local news organizations than a national news outlet that's looking to explain to folks why they should care about this national issue going on.
So I definitely understand what a story is in terms of the newsiness, the timeliness, how it fits into the reporter's beats already, how it fits into what they cover. Less so much news just because you think it's news, but how it's actually usable with the reporter and the outlet. So thank you for that. We have a couple of questions that I'm going to get to. One is from Tessie. I work for an organization that produces research to further racial justice. We put out a very detailed report every year called Race Counts, which I'm familiar with. Race Counts measures more than 40 indicators for California populations across race. How should I be developing this for a story or more than one story, especially when the data keeps showing trends that are not significantly changing for the better from year to year for Black Californians? And so this is a situation where it's not necessarily the first Race Counts report. And full disclosure, we actually did the media for the first Race Counts launch, which is different than like for a story that keeps going. And figuring out how to make sure, like, how to keep it new and fresh and get attention as you continue to pitch kind of an ongoing story. I'm just curious if y'all have any advice for Tessie on that.
Yeah, it's difficult to think like for an ongoing story, something like that is tough if there's not constantly anything new. I mean, I think the thing is you just have to pitch it as not necessarily new information, but like, hey, things are not, if what your data is showing, things are consistently either getting worse or just not really getting better for Black Americans. You know, is there, for example, any data on how life is changing for white Americans? Is there anything that you can contrast it to that would make it a story as opposed to data? Are there any groups that you can connect with before you pitch who might have important stories that kind of fit into what you're doing? So I think that's always the thing, like, because a compelling narrative is always going to get not always, but generally speaking, a really compelling narrative is going to get published. So if you can find a group that can give you someone who's talking about, my life hasn't improved, I've been doing X, Y, and Z, I can't get out of poverty, and then you can bring that to a reporter along with the data. Or you can say, hey, we work with this group, we think that they might be able to help you find someone, even something not as far along as that. That's going to get a reporter to say, oh, I can do this story in a few days, because unfortunately we're working on crazy short timelines. We're all really busy, and as are you guys as well. But it's really helpful if there's something where it's like, oh, I can take this to an editor in the next couple of days and have something really good. And something that can come out. So that would be kind of my way of thinking through pitching a story like that to a reporter.
I would also add, and my hope is that someday this won't even cross our mind, but can you connect it to what we're seeing today? So I know one of the things that you had mentioned was Black Californians consistently face several times more police harassment / arrests. Can you connect it to whatever's happening today? You know, we just saw what happened to Sonia Macy, right? Can you find a way to connect that data and say this is a trend that we can extrapolate outside of just California? And when that happens, here can be the result. And again, my hope is that someday that is not a story that we can link to. But that was sort of where my mind went to, is if that's happening in California, where else is that happening? How similar are the numbers across states? Are they different depending on if you're in a red or a blue state? Is it different depending on population size? So if there's more Black Americans versus less Black Americans, and then, you know, is there information to show then what happens after the police harassment / arrest that would make it, and I hate to use this word, it's totally just for lack of a better word, but make it newsy for our editors to see it as something that deserves the coverage.
Those are great points, and I think for one thing that also would be a good idea, and Cheyenne kind of spoke to this too, is using what might be like high profile stories at the time that speak to what is represented in the report. So I think of it like if the report covers police harassment, arrests, and things like that. If there is a high profile story that happens, you might not get someone to focus a story completely on the report, but you can get them to mention it. And as consistently as we report or we see like Black people being harmed in a variety of ways in California, you'll have plenty of opportunities to be like, hey, just in case you guys are working on this latest high profile thing that happened, we got a little report that kind of reflects this. And then next thing you know, you have 4 outlets over the course of a month that have linked to the report. And newsrooms kind of remember those things where editors will be like, anyway, it becomes a thing. So just be willing to maybe not have a piece focus on it, but be mentioned to back up something that happened.
I would also suggest too, I have my podcast, and I think a story like that, if you pitch that for an audio element, right? A lot of, especially even national news organizations, when they do their morning podcast, they do like 2 to 3 stories that are very sort of quick hits, 5 minutes each. Like that could work incredibly well for a podcast or a news show that's not necessarily print or video, where they can sit there and talk with, maybe the leader of the organization to say, we just did this report. Here's what our report found. Here's how this impacts, let's say, 2024's election in the state of California. Things of that nature where, I think oftentimes when we think of pitching, we're thinking of digital writing or that broadcast news element. And we have to remember that there is that gap there with audio podcasting, and podcasting does have quite a big following, especially amongst younger listeners, younger audience at this point in time.
Definitely want to plug your podcast in particular, because you have so many awesome folks on there talking about Black power, Black politics, and things like that. So we'll, in a follow-up email, we'll send that in the email that we send to. We have I wish we could talk about this for a long time, but we only have about 8 more minutes left. We do have one more question I do want to get to for whoever wants to answer it. We talked about intersectionality earlier. And this question is from Chris Wilson from Power Pack, and he talks about how in this election cycle, we're seeing prominent Black elected leaders who carry a pro-Black agenda getting primaried by AIPAC because they're not as pro-Israel as they could be. And mainstream media and even some Black media might be ignoring kind of the racism and double standard behind these efforts to remove Black leadership in politics. We just saw that with Cori Bush. What is, or how can we create an effective narrative that calls out the racism and double standard in actions like this? I know that is a complex question and answer. Anyone want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say on a story like that, I mean, I have certainly seen some outlets pick it up. I want to say The Nation, and The Intercept have both covered, and the Daily Beast actually as well, I think have both have covered this issue, in particularly kind of the specific attacks on Black progressives and trying to push Black progressives out, and why the money has been spent on Black progressives in particular. But I would say if you're looking to pitch stories like that, the big thing is just to look for outlets that care about those kinds of stories. So definitely progressive outlets. So somewhere like Teen Vogue is always kind of a good space for that. The Nation, The Intercept, Mother Jones. There are definitely outlets that care about that issue in particular. And then there are some that are less friendly to those types of conversations in particular. So I think it's just knowing your audience and knowing where things are just going to be a non-starter with editors. And I would say that story is not a non-starter with editors, but probably difficult to land at a lot of outlets. I would say mostly progressive leaning outlets would be the focus.
I would add too, for something like that, and I'm thinking about how I would approach that type of story. And I actually just did a story last week on Cori Bush and the primary and concerns over, and I think The Intercept first reported it. We had said on concerns over ads that were darkening or like changing her skin tone, elongating her features, things of that nature. And her opponent was APAC backed. I think one way to help get that maybe into, and I use the word mainstream, but very cautiously, mainstream media is, can you find a way to make it more of that unbiased perspective? So can you offer me perhaps a professor or an expert who can sit there and talk about why perhaps this organization is trying to straddle or separate Black candidates rather than having Black candidates come together in a unified way. And I mean, realistically, we know that it's a white supremacist tactic that we like to separate folks, but can you bring somebody forward who can talk to the history of that? Can you bring somebody forward who can talk to the history of how APAC perhaps chooses their candidates, and then go even as far as with current events right now? What does it mean when we see Black candidates who are more pro-Israel, more pro-Palestine? How is that going to affect the outcome of the election? Something in that way that allows it to be less of a us saying that, you know, this is a racist tactic, and more of a source who can bring in a sort of educated perspective. Again, these are very charged words. I don't mean for them to be charged, but thinking of the way our editors think, you have to be able to bring us somebody who we can sit there and say, this is not some Black Panther out here talking about how we need to be providing free breakfast in the streets for Black kids, right? Like, you have to find a way to frame it where you're saying, this is somebody who brings a legitimate background of historical research, politics, whatever that is, and here's why they're qualified to speak on this for your mainstream outlet. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you for keeping it all the way real and how we have to try to maneuver to break through. I feel like that was a really good insight you just gave us. And Justin, were you gonna?
No, those, Jessica, Cheyenne, those are brilliant answers. Like I don't even really think I have much to add to that, but I agree with both of them.
Well, thank you so much, y'all, for joining us. I did want to just maybe give y'all just one last final line in terms of what vision you hold for Black stories and Black narratives. If you maybe could just have a few closing words, and then I will also close this out. Jessica, maybe we'll start with you. If you have any final words around the power of Black stories, Black narratives, and Black storytellers like y'all.
I mean, I think just for me and what I've done in my career and what I'm excited to continue doing is just opening people up to the complexity of Black identity, and also making people recognize that there are issues that are considered Black issues, but Black people deal with all kinds of different issues and intersectionality, particularly when I report a lot on gender and Black women specifically, and that, you know, that we experience all kinds of things in this country. And so we don't have to just think about Black issues only in one valence, only in criminal justice, although that's incredibly important. But there's a lot of issues that are Black issues.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you. How about you, Cheyenne?
A big hope of mine, as we continue down this road of hopefully progress, is that Black stories sort of become mainstream, where we don't have to have a section of this is our Black news, even though I do think it's important that we have our own community. And I think part of that is by normalizing the fact that there are Black experts that can speak on more than just Black issues, right? Like we can go to Black women just to talk about healthcare. We can go to Black women to talk about foreign affairs. Black folks don't only have to talk about, kind of like Jessica was saying, we don't only have to talk about criminal justice. We are experts on so much more than just what many want to reduce us to.
Amazing. Thank you. Justin.
Yeah, and I guess my hope is that, or like my vision is that Black folks who are consumers of news will start getting the respect that they deserve. Like a lot of newsrooms feel like they don't have to write for Black readers because they assume that they don't have any. Black people consume news coverage just as much as everybody else. We are in tune politically. I hope, as we move forward, like our base as consumers of news gets the respect that it deserves.
Amazing. Mic drop. Perfect way to close it. Thank you all so much for these thoughtful responses and this beautiful conversation. I just want to say I'm really grateful that you all are in the media telling these important stories and doing amazing work. Thank you all for joining us today for our first Change the Story event. And I also want to say thank you to my team, in particular, Layla, Lana, and Larisha for making this event happen. If you don't already, follow us on social media for more upcoming events, and please feel free to reach out to us directly at hello@change-llc.com. This was our first of this kind of event, but we'll be doing a lot more because we really want to do more than just client work. We really want to actively change the story. So thank you all for your time. I appreciate you and so grateful for you, and have a good day.